What you're about to hear will shatter everything you thought you knew about family, about belonging, and about the lengths people will go to protect the innocent. This isn't just another Wild West story about gunfights and gold rushes. This is a tale that will reach into your chest, grab your heart, and refuse to let go until the very last word. Picture this. The year is 1884 in the unforgiving territory of Montana, where the law was as scarce as water in August and human decency was a luxury most folks couldn't afford. A childless couple, their hearts hollowed by years of devastating loss and shattered dreams, approaches a barn on their newly purchased property. They're expecting to find livestock, maybe some chickens, perhaps a stubborn mule too old to sell. Instead, they discover 5 abandoned children, forgotten by the world, left to die like unwanted cargo in the suffocating darkness. But here's what will stop your breath cold. That shocking discovery was nothing, absolutely nothing compared to what happened when the law decided those children were property to be sold, not souls to be saved. What followed was a battle that would tear an entire community apart, set buildings ablaze in the dead of night, and force 2 broken hearts to choose between their own safety and the salvation of 5 innocents who had no one else to fight for them. How did it come to this? How does a simple act of mercy, opening a barn door, sharing a meal, offering shelter, ignite a war that threatens to destroy everything they've built? How does love become a crime punishable by death? And when the whole weight of a corrupt system comes crashing down on a family that dared to say, "These children matter," what price are they willing to pay to prove that some things are worth fighting for? Stay with me, because this story of the Morrison Ranch will challenge every assumption you have about justice, about courage, and about what makes a family. You'll witness acts of breathtaking cruelty and stunning heroism. You'll see how ordinary people become extraordinary when they're pushed beyond their breaking point. You'll discover that sometimes the most powerful force in the world isn't violence or wealth or political authority. It's the unwavering determination of people who refuse to look away from suffering. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we reach that explosive confrontation, before we see bullets fly and buildings burn, before we witness a community unite against impossible odds, let me take you back to that fateful morning when fate hung on rusty hinges and 5 small lives waited in the darkness for someone brave enough to step into the light. This is their story. This is how a family was forged in fire, how love conquered law, and how 5 forgotten children changed the course of an entire territory's history. Are you ready for this journey? Because once we open this door, there's no going back. The barn door groaned like something dying, not from neglect, but from the weight of secrets it had been forced to keep. Elizabeth Morrison wiped her palms on her apron as her husband Samuel pushed the weathered wood wider, morning light streaming into the musty darkness like judgment itself. Dust motes danced in the amber beams, and the air hung thick with the smell of old hay, mildew, and something else. Something alive. They'd bought the Whitmore property site unseen, desperate to escape the suffocating silence of their childless home in Kansas. The land agent, a sharp-suited man with oil in his voice and greed in his eyes, had mentioned the barn came with some livestock to clear out. Samuel had assumed he meant chickens, maybe a stubborn mule too old to sell. He hadn't expected children, 5 of them, huddled together like broken dolls in the corner, heads bowed, eyes hollow with the kind of emptiness that comes from being forgotten by the world. The oldest couldn't have been more than 12, the youngest barely 5, all of them silent, watching, waiting. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat like a sob she couldn't release. The tallest boy, blonde hair tangled with straw, knees scraped raw, stepped forward just enough to place himself between the others and the strangers in the doorway. He didn't speak, but his small shoulders squared with the defiance of someone who'd learned too young that protection was a luxury you provided for yourself. "Samuel," Elizabeth whispered, her voice barely audible above the thundering of her own heart. But Samuel had gone rigid, staring at the impossible scene before them. Behind them, the land agent's voice continued its practiced litany about deed transfers and property boundaries, oblivious to the human tragedy that had just been unveiled. Why are there children in our barn? Elizabeth's voice cracked as she spun to face the agent. The man's smile never wavered, cold and calculated as winter moonlight. Left behind with the property, ma'am. Previous owner died owing more than the land was worth. Had these workers helping maintain the place. They ain't bloodkin, just strays he took in off the streets. Workers? Samuel's voice carried the edge of a man who'd seen enough of the world to recognize evil when it smiled at him. The agent shrugged with practiced indifference. They were supposed to be transferred with the livestock sale. You can still send them to the work camps if you want. Always someone willing to pay for hands that size, especially in the mines up north. Elizabeth stepped backward as if she'd been struck. You mean sell them? They're not yours to keep, ma'am, the agent said, his tone suggesting this conversation was becoming tiresome. Technically, they don't belong to anyone now. State turns a blind eye as long as nobody complains too loud. The silence that followed was deafening. Elizabeth could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 5 pairs of desperate eyes watching from the shadows, could sense the crossroads moment that would define not just this day, but the rest of their lives. No, she said, the word emerging with quiet steel. We're not doing that. Samuel studied his wife's face, the same expression she'd worn when they'd buried their dreams of children alongside 3 tiny caskets, when the doctor had delivered the news that there would be no more chances, no more hope. But this time, instead of defeat, he saw something different. He saw fire. He stepped past her into the barn, his boots crunching on the straw-covered floor. You kids hungry? He asked, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't name. The smallest child, a girl with hair so matted it looked like dark moss, nodded once, the movement barely perceptible. Something broke open inside Elizabeth's chest, and she moved toward them like a woman sleepwalking through a miracle. Come on, she said gently, extending her hand to the nearest child. Let's get you cleaned up and fed. None of the children spoke as she led them from the barn to the house. They ate the cornbread and milk she placed before them like starving animals. Quick, quiet, grateful. Their silence was deafening, broken only by the soft sounds of desperate hunger finally being fed. The girl with the dark hair was the first to find her voice, a whisper so hoarse it sounded like wind through dry leaves. We ain't thieves, ma'am. He made us work for our keep. Said if we did good, he'd feed us proper. Then he died, and we thought we'd die too. Elizabeth's hand stilled on the dish rag she'd been using to clean the table. What's your name, sweetheart? The girl paused as if the question itself was foreign. Rose, ma'am, and these others are my responsibility now. She pointed to each child in turn. That's Benjamin, he's the oldest. Then comes Joshua and Sarah, they're twins, and the little one's Mary. She don't talk much since the bad things happened. Benjamin, the blond boy who'd stood guard in the barn, fixed Elizabeth with a look that seemed far too old for his 12 years. You fixing to send us away? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elizabeth knelt beside his chair, bringing herself to his eye level. Not today, not ever, if I have anything to say about it. Something flickered in his eyes. Not hope, not yet, but the faintest possibility that hope might someday be allowed to exist. Samuel stood in the doorway, watching it all unfold. He remembered the weight of those tiny caskets, remembered Elizabeth crying herself into exhaustion night after night, remembered the crushing silence that had settled over their home like dust over abandoned furniture. But tonight their kitchen buzzed with life. Frightened, fragile life, but life nonetheless. He stepped onto the porch as twilight painted the sky purple and gold. The same stars that had witnessed their grief now looked down on something different, something that felt dangerously close to blessing. Behind him, tentative laughter bubbled up from the kitchen, weak and uncertain, but real. But Samuel had lived long enough to know that peace was a fragile thing in a world built on cruelty. He could feel it in his bones, in the way the evening wind carried more than just the scent of approaching rain. The land agent hadn't ridden away in defeat. He'd retreated to plan. And men who traded in human misery didn't take kindly to having their property stolen, even by mercy. The war was coming. Samuel just didn't know when. Dawn broke over the Morrison Ranch like a promise being kept. For the first time in years, the house breathed with purpose instead of just existing. The silence that had once pressed down on Elizabeth and Samuel like a lead blanket had been replaced by something precious, the soft sounds of children stirring to life. Elizabeth rose before the sun crested the hills, muscle memory pulling her from sleep at the same hour she'd always awakened to tend an empty house. But today, as she padded barefoot to the kitchen, she heard it, a tiny whimper from the children's room, not the demanding wail of a child accustomed to being heard, but the careful, muffled crying of someone who'd learned that making noise could be dangerous. She found little Mary sitting on the edge of the makeshift bed Samuel had constructed from hay bales and old quilts, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. The child couldn't have been more than 5, but her eyes held the weariness of someone who'd seen too much of the world's cruelty. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Elizabeth whispered, settling beside her on the bed. Mary pointed to her stomach and mouthed the word hungry, but made no sound. Even in her need, she'd been trained not to ask for anything. Elizabeth's heart shattered and rebuilt itself in the space of a heartbeat. "Well, let's fix that right now." As she prepared breakfast, real breakfast, with eggs from their chickens and bacon from their smokehouse, the other children began to emerge. Benjamin stood guard by the door, still suspicious of this kindness that seemed too good to be true. Rose helped Mary wash her face in the basin, gentle as a mother despite being barely 8 years old herself. The twins, Joshua and Sarah, whispered to each other in a language only they understood, their eyes darting between the adults and the nearest exit. Samuel joined them as the morning light painted the kitchen golden. He'd been awake for hours, walking the property line, checking the fences, but really just thinking. "Sleep okay?" he asked Elizabeth. She nodded toward the children. "They did. I think it's the first safe sleep they've had in months." Benjamin looked up from his plate, suspicion warring with hope in his young face. "You really meant it? About us staying?" Elizabeth set down her coffee cup and faced all 5 children. "This house has been too quiet for too long. You've given us something we thought we'd lost forever." "What's that?" Rose asked, her voice still barely above a whisper. "Purpose," Samuel said simply. "Meaning. A reason to wake up in the morning that goes beyond just surviving another day." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of possibility, of tentative trust, of the first fragile shoots of something that might someday grow into belonging. But the peace was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast and hard. Samuel was at the window before the rider had even reached the gate. Through the glass, he saw a lone horseman in a clean coat and polished boots. Too clean for honest ranch work, too fine for a man who earned his living with his hands. "Stay inside," Samuel instructed the children, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Elizabeth, keep them away from the windows." The man dismounted with deliberate slowness, making a show of brushing dust from his sleeves before approaching the porch. Everything about him screamed officialdom and trouble. "Name's Jeremiah Blackwood," the man called out, his voice carrying the kind of false politeness that set Samuel's teeth on edge. "I'm a county representative, sent to resolve a certain misunderstanding." Samuel stepped onto the porch but kept his hand near the rifle propped by the door. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Blackwood's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Seems there's been some confusion about certain assets that came with the Whitmore property. I'm here to collect them before this situation gets complicated." "If you're talking about those children, they're not assets," Elizabeth said, appearing in the doorway despite Samuel's instruction to stay inside. "They're human beings who deserve safety and care." "Ma'am, I appreciate your charitable instincts," Blackwood said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But the law is clear. These children were indentured workers on the Whitmore property. Their contracts transfer with the land, and the state has already made arrangements for their placement." "What kind of arrangements?" Samuel's voice carried a dangerous edge. Blackwood shrugged. "Work programs, character building opportunities, places where they can learn discipline and earn their keep. The mines up north are always looking for small hands to work the narrow veins." Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. "You're talking about slavery." "I'm talking about the law," Blackwood replied. "You have until tomorrow noon to turn them over peacefully. After that, I'll be forced to involve the sheriff, and nobody wants that kind of unpleasantness." He remounted his horse with the same theatrical precision he'd used to dismount. Think carefully, Mr. Morrison. You're new to these parts. Wouldn't want to start off on the wrong foot with the authorities. As Blackwood rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and implied threats in his wake, Samuel and Elizabeth stood frozen on their porch. Behind them, 5 pairs of eyes watched through the crack in the door, having heard every word. That night, the house felt different again, not with the warmth of new beginning, but with the cold weight of impending loss. The children huddled together on their makeshift beds, whispering among themselves in voices too low for the adults to hear. Elizabeth found Samuel sitting at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed, staring into a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "What are we going to do?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands wrapped around the cup like it was an anchor in a storm. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know what we're not going to do. We're not going to let them take these kids to die in some godforsaken mine. Even if it means fighting the law." Samuel looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw the same determination that had carried them through the loss of their own children, through the long years of grief and silence. Especially then. From the children's room came the soft sound of Mary crying again, but this time Rose's voice joined her, humming a lullaby in a voice cracked with fear and premature wisdom. It was the sound of children comforting children, of the young protecting the even younger, because no adult ever had. Elizabeth and Samuel sat in the darkness, listening to that heartbreaking lullaby, and knew that tomorrow would bring a reckoning. They just didn't know yet what form their defiance would take, but they knew one thing for certain. Some things were worth fighting for, even if the fight seemed impossible to win. The morning of reckoning came gray and overcast, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Elizabeth woke to find Benjamin already dressed and standing by the window, watching the road with the intensity of a sentry. He'd barely slept, she realized. Probably hadn't slept at all. "They coming?" she asked softly. Benjamin nodded without turning around. "Been riders on the ridge since before dawn. 3, maybe 4. They're waiting for something." Samuel appeared in the doorway, rifle in hand. "Waiting for Blackwood, most likely. He'll want witnesses when he comes to collect." The breakfast they shared was quiet, tense. The children ate mechanically, their eyes constantly darting to the windows and doors. Rose kept Mary close, stroking her hair with the protective instincts of someone far too young to bear such responsibility. The twins held hands under the table, their knuckles white with tension. "I want you all to know something," Samuel said, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Whatever happens today, you're part of this family now. That's not going to change because some man in a fancy coat says it should." "But what if they make us go?" Joshua whispered, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived. Elizabeth reached across the table and covered his small hand with hers. "Then we'll fight it. In the courts, in the papers, wherever we have to fight it. You're not alone anymore." The sound of multiple horses approaching cut through the morning air like a blade. Samuel stood checking the rifle's load one final time. "Remember what we talked about," he said to Elizabeth. "Keep them in the back room, away from the windows." But Benjamin stepped forward, his young jaw set with determination that belonged on a much older face. "No, sir. We should be here for this. We're the ones they're coming for." "Son, this isn't your fight." "It is our fight," Rose interrupted, her voice stronger than anyone had heard it before. "We've been running and hiding our whole lives. If you're willing to stand up for us, then we should stand up too." Samuel looked at these 5 children, these brave, broken, beautiful children, and felt something shift in his chest. They weren't just victims anymore. They were fighters. Blackwood arrived with more than witnesses. The county sheriff rode beside him, along with 2 deputies and a man in a black suit who carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. "Mr. Morrison," Blackwood called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying across the yard with false joviality, "I trust you've had time to consider our conversation." Samuel stepped onto the porch, Elizabeth and the 5 children flanking him like a family prepared for war. "I've considered it. The answer is no." The sheriff, a weathered man named Cooper, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Sam, I've known you since you moved to these parts. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. It doesn't need to be hard at all, Sheriff, Samuel replied evenly. All you need to do is ride away and leave these children in peace. The man in the black suit, who'd remained silent until now, stepped forward. Mr. Morrison, I'm Judge Whitmore, and I'm here to inform you that you're in violation of territorial law. These children are legally bound workers, and their contracts have been sold to a mining consortium in Colorado. You will surrender them immediately or face charges of theft and kidnapping. Elizabeth felt her world tilt. Whitmore? As in the previous owner of this property? The judge's smile was thin and sharp as a knife blade. My late brother's property, yes. He had his faults, but he was a legitimate businessman. These children represent a significant investment, and that investment will be protected. Benjamin stepped forward, his young voice cutting through the tension like a sword. Your brother was a monster who worked us near to death and fed us scraps. He died drunk and alone, and nobody mourned him. Judge Whitmore's face darkened. You will not speak of your betters in such terms, boy. Betters? Rose's voice shook with rage. He locked us in that barn without food for 3 days when Joshua got sick and couldn't work. We ate grass and prayed for rain so we could drink from the puddles. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the deputies looked uncomfortable, shifting in their saddles as the reality of what they were here to do became impossible to ignore. Sheriff Cooper cleared his throat. Judge, maybe we should take a step back here. These are children, not livestock. They are property, Whitmore snapped. Property that has been legally transferred to new owners who have paid good money for their labor. This is not a discussion. It's a legal enforcement action. Samuel raised the rifle, not pointing it at anyone, but making its presence unmistakable. Then you'll have to enforce it over my dead body. That can be arranged, one of the deputies said, his hand moving to his pistol. But before anyone could draw a weapon, the sound of more horses filled the air. A wagon rolled into the yard, driven by Mrs. Fletcher from the neighboring ranch, with half a dozen other neighbors riding alongside her. Morning, Sheriff, Mrs. Fletcher called out, her voice deceptively casual. Heard there might be some trouble out this way. Thought we'd stop by and see what all the fuss was about. Behind her came old Jake Morrison, no relation to Samuel despite the name, the blacksmith Tom Bradley, and several other local ranchers. They positioned themselves around the yard with the casual air of people who just happened to be passing by. But their presence changed everything. Judge Whitmore's confident demeanor flickered. This is official business. I'll ask you all to move along. Public road, Jake said laconically, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. Free country. Reckon we can sit here as long as we please. Mrs. Fletcher climbed down from her wagon and approached the porch. Elizabeth, dear, these wouldn't be those poor orphan children I heard about, would they? They would, Elizabeth replied, understanding immediately what was happening. Well, they look like they could use some decent clothes and a good meal, Mrs. Fletcher continued, her voice carrying to every person in the yard. Been far too long since we had children's laughter in this valley. One by one, the neighbors began to speak, not to the officials, but to each other, as if Blackwood and his delegation simply didn't exist. Shame what happened to the Whitmore place, Tom Bradley mused. Heard tell there were children living in conditions that would make a decent person sick. Course, that's all changed now, Jake added. Morrisons are good people. Those kids are lucky to have found them. Judge Whitmore's face flushed red with frustration. This circus doesn't change the law. Sheriff, I'm ordering you to arrest Mr. Morrison and seize those children. Sheriff Cooper looked around at the faces surrounding him. Neighbors he'd known for years. People who'd voted him into office, whose children played with his own children. Finally, he shook his head. Judge, I think maybe we should take this matter back to town. Get some legal opinions from people who specialize in this kind of thing. I am a judge. I am the legal opinion. You're also the brother of the man who abused these children, Elizabeth said quietly. Seems like that might create what they call a conflict of interest. The standoff stretched like a wire about to snap. Then little Mary did something that changed everything. She stepped forward, walked right up to Judge Whitmore's horse, and looked up at him with eyes that held no fear, only pity. My mama's in heaven, she said in her tiny voice, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived at the ranch. She told me before she died that angels would come to save me. I think she was right. She turned and walked back to Elizabeth, taking her hand with perfect trust. Judge Whitmore stared down at this little girl, who just called him something less than an angel, and for a moment, his carefully constructed authority cracked. Around the yard, hard-faced ranchers and weathered farm wives watched him with expressions that ranged from contempt to outright hostility. "This isn't over," he said finally, wheeling his horse around. "There are higher authorities than county sheriffs. There are federal marshals who don't concern themselves with local politics." As the official delegation rode away, the neighbors lingered, making sure the threat had truly passed. Mrs. Fletcher climbed back onto her wagon but paused before leaving. "Elizabeth, I'll be stopping by tomorrow with some fabric. These children need proper clothes for Sunday service." "Sunday service?" Elizabeth asked. Mrs. Fletcher smiled. "Well, they'll need somewhere to go when Pastor Williams introduces them to the congregation as the newest members of our community. Hard to remove children who've been formally welcomed into the church family." As the last of the neighbors departed, Samuel and Elizabeth stood on their porch with 5 children who were no longer quite so frightened, no longer quite so alone. The battle wasn't won. Judge Whitmore's threats carried real weight, and they all knew it. But they'd learned something important today. They weren't fighting alone. "What happens now?" Benjamin asked. Samuel looked down at this boy who'd stood up to a judge with nothing but courage and the truth. "Now we get ready for the next fight, because men like Judge Whitmore don't give up easy." "Will you give up?" Rose asked quietly. Elizabeth knelt down to meet her eyes. "Never," she said simply. "Not ever." That night, as the children finally slept, really slept, without fear or vigilance, Samuel and Elizabeth sat on their porch in the darkness. The stars overhead seemed brighter somehow, as if the day's events had burned away some atmospheric haze that had been obscuring their light. "Think we can win this?" Elizabeth asked. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "I think we already have," he said finally. "Not the legal fight. That's still coming. But the important fight, the one for their hearts, for their trust, for their belief that they deserve better than what the world's been giving them." From inside the house came the soft sound of children breathing in sleep, not the shallow, fearful breathing of the hunted, but the deep, peaceful rhythm of the safe. They'd crossed a line today, Samuel and Elizabeth Morrison. They'd declared themselves enemies of a system that treated children like commodities, and there would be consequences for that choice. But as they listened to the lullaby of sleeping children, their children now, in every way that mattered, they knew they'd made the only choice they could live with. The war was just beginning, but tonight, love was winning. 3 days passed in deceptive quiet. The children began to settle into the rhythm of ranch life, helping with chores, learning their letters from Elizabeth, following Samuel around the property like a parade of shadows, eager to absorb everything he could teach them. For brief moments, it almost felt like peace. But Samuel knew better. He'd lived through enough conflicts to recognize the eerie calm that preceded a storm. Judge Whitmore wasn't the type of man to accept defeat gracefully, and men with his kind of power had resources beyond local sheriff departments. The first sign of trouble came from an unexpected source. Little Mary. She'd been playing near the well when she came running to the house, her face pale with fear. "Bad men," she whispered, clutching Elizabeth's skirt. "In the trees. Watching." Samuel grabbed his rifle and scanned the tree line. At first he saw nothing. Then a glint of sunlight off metal caught his eye. Someone with a spyglass, positioned where they could observe the house without being easily seen. "How many?" he asked Mary gently. She held up 3 fingers, then added a 4th with her other hand. Samuel cursed under his breath. 4 men conducting surveillance meant this wasn't just intimidation. It was reconnaissance for something bigger. That evening, after the children were in bed, Samuel and Elizabeth held a war council in their kitchen. Maps spread across the table showed the ranch's boundaries, the approach routes, the defensible positions. "They're planning something," Samuel said, pointing to marks he'd made on the map. "Professional surveillance, multiple angles of observation. This isn't some local muscle hired to scare us. This is organized." Elizabeth traced the perimeter of their property with her finger. "What do you think they want?" "To make an example of us. Show everyone what happens when you cross the wrong people." A soft knock at the door interrupted their planning. Samuel approached cautiously, rifle ready, but relaxed when he saw familiar faces through the window. Jake Morrison stood on the porch with Tom Bradley and three other neighbors, all armed, all grim-faced. "Evening, Sam," Jake said without preamble. "Mind if we come in?" The kitchen suddenly felt crowded with 6 adults, but the presence of allies was more comforting than confining. "We've been talking," Mrs. Fletcher said, appearing last through the door with a basket of supplies. "About what Judge Whitmore said. About federal marshals?" Tom Bradley leaned against the wall, his blacksmith's hands scarred from years of working hot metal. "Thing is, we did some asking around. Turns out there's no federal involvement in this matter. Not yet, anyway." "Meaning?" Elizabeth asked. "Meaning Judge Whitmore's working on his own authority, maybe with some territorial backing, but nothing that gives him the right to bring in outside muscle," Jake explained, "which makes those men watching your place unauthorized." Samuel felt a grim smile tug at his lips. "Trespassers." "Armed trespassers," Mrs. Fletcher corrected, "on property belonging to folks who have every right to defend themselves." The conversation that followed was brief and to the point. These weren't people given to flowery speeches or grand gestures. They were practical folks who decided to take a practical approach to a problem. By the time the neighbors left, the plan was simple: rotating watches, established signals, and a clear understanding that any aggressive action toward the Morrison Ranch would be met with overwhelming response from the entire community. Samuel almost allowed himself to hope that the show of force would be enough to deter whatever Judge Whitmore had planned. He was wrong. The attack came at dawn, when the eastern sky was just beginning to blush with pale light, and the world was caught in that vulnerable moment between night and day. Samuel was in the barn tending to the animals when he heard Elizabeth scream. He ran toward the house to find thick black smoke pouring from the kitchen window. Flames licked at the walls with hungry orange tongues, and through the chaos he could hear the children crying inside. "Elizabeth!" he shouted, racing toward the front door. "We're here!" Her voice came from the side of the house. "The children are safe!" But the fire... Samuel burst through the front door into a wall of heat and smoke. The kitchen was fully engulfed, flames spreading rapidly toward the rest of the house. But something was wrong. The fire was too big, too fast, for an accidental blaze. Then he saw the broken glass and the smell hit him. Kerosene. This wasn't an accident. This was arson. "Sam!" Benjamin's voice cut through the crackling of flames. "There's men! In the trees!" Samuel grabbed his rifle and what supplies he could carry from the burning house, then herded everyone toward the barn. As they ran, he could see muzzle flashes from the tree line. Someone was shooting at them as they fled their burning home. "Stay low," he shouted, pushing the children ahead of him. "Get to the barn!" A bullet whined past his ear, close enough that he could feel the wind of its passage. Behind them, their house, their sanctuary, their home, burned like a funeral pyre against the morning sky. In the relative safety of the barn, Elizabeth gathered the children while Samuel peered through the gaps in the walls, trying to count their attackers. What he saw made his blood run cold. At least 6 men, positioned in a rough circle around the property, all armed with rifles. "Papa Samuel," Rose whispered, the first time she'd called him that, "are they going to kill us?" Samuel looked into her frightened face and felt something crystallize inside him, hard and cold as winter steel. These men had just burned down the home of 5 children, had shot at those same children as they fled for their lives. Whatever legal protection Judge Whitmore thought he had, this crossed every line of civilized behavior. "No, sweetheart," he said quietly. "They're not." The battle that followed was brief but vicious. Samuel had advantages the attackers hadn't counted on. He knew every inch of his property. He was fighting for something more valuable than money, and he wasn't alone. The sound of gunfire carried for miles in the still morning air, and within minutes, neighbors began arriving. Jake Morrison and his sons came first, followed by Tom Bradley and a handful of other ranchers. What had been intended as a quick, brutal lesson became a pitched battle between Judge Whitmore's hired guns and an entire community that had decided enough was enough. When the shooting stopped, 2 of the attackers lay dead in the grass, and the rest had fled. The neighbors pursued them for several miles before giving up the chase, satisfied that the immediate threat had passed. But the cost was devastating. The Morrison house was a total loss. Nothing left but a blackened shell and the acrid smell of everything they'd built together going up in smoke. Elizabeth stood in the yard holding little Mary, staring at the ruins of their home. The children clustered around her, all of them crying, not just from fear, but from the crushing realization that safety was an illusion, that there was nowhere they could go, that hatred couldn't find them. "It's gone," she whispered. "Everything's gone." Samuel put his arms around his family, and they were a family now, forged in fire and bound by blood spilled in their defense. "The house is gone," he said firmly, "but we're not. We're still here, we're still together, and that's what matters." Mrs. Fletcher approached with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Elizabeth, dear, you can't stay here. Not with those children. It's not safe." For a moment, Elizabeth wavered. The practical part of her mind screamed that Mrs. Fletcher was right. They should take the children and run, disappear into the vastness of the frontier where Judge Whitmore's reach couldn't follow. But then Benjamin stepped forward, his young face set with determination that should have belonged to someone much older. "If we run," he said quietly, "then they win. And the next family that tries to help kids like us, what happens to them?" Samuel looked at this remarkable boy, this child who'd been through hell and emerged with his courage intact, and knew there was only one answer. "Then we don't run," he said. "We rebuild. We make this place stronger than it was before, and we make it clear that we're not going anywhere." That night they slept in the barn, all 7 of them huddled together on beds of hay and borrowed blankets. It should have been miserable, cold, uncomfortable, a symbol of how far they'd fallen. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something new, something that couldn't be burned down or shot at, or stolen by men in fancy suits who thought children were property to be bought and sold. As Elizabeth drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the gentle breathing of 5 children who called her mama, and the steady presence of the man who'd chosen to fight the world rather than abandon them, she realized something profound. Home wasn't the building they'd lost. Home was this circle of love and protection and stubborn defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. Let Judge Whitmore bring his federal marshals, his hired guns, his legal documents and official seals. Let him bring the full weight of a system that treated children like livestock and called it law. They'd be ready. The federal marshal arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the fire, riding a black gelding and wearing the kind of expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Marshal Henry Crawford was a lean man with graying temples and eyes that had seen too much of humanity's capacity for cruelty. He dismounted slowly, his gaze taking in the charred remains of the Morrison house and the makeshift camp that had sprung up around the barn. Samuel emerged from the temporary shelter they'd constructed, rifle in hand but not raised, a show of caution, not aggression. Behind him came Elizabeth and the children, all of them wearing clothes donated by neighbors, all of them standing with the quiet dignity of people who'd been tested by fire and emerged unbroken. "Marshal Crawford," Samuel said with a nod, "wasn't expecting federal involvement in what amounts to a local custody dispute." Crawford's weathered face showed surprise. "You know who I am? Word travels fast out here. Question is, do you know what really happened to bring you all this way?" The marshal's eyes swept the burned foundation, the bullet holes in the barn walls, the small cemetery plot where they'd buried the 2 attackers who'd died in the gunfight. "I know what Judge Whitmore told me. I know what the territorial authorities reported. But I also know that none of their stories quite add up." Elizabeth stepped forward, Mary clinging to her skirt. "What did they tell you, Marshal?" Crawford pulled a document from his coat pocket. "Says here that you folks kidnapped 5 indentured workers, refused to surrender them to legal authorities, and then opened fire on peace officers trying to execute a lawful warrant." Benjamin laughed, a bitter sound that held no trace of childhood innocence. "Peace officers? Is that what they're calling the men who burned down our house and shot at us while we ran?" The marshal's eyes sharpened. "Tell me what happened, son. All of it." What followed was the most honest conversation Samuel had ever witnessed. The children, His children now, in every way that mattered, told their stories without flinching. Rose described the conditions they'd endured under the previous owner: the hunger, the beatings, the nights locked in the barn with no food or water. Joshua and Sarah spoke in turns about watching their friends die from exhaustion and neglect. Mary, in her tiny voice, recounted how she learned to cry silently because making noise brought punishment. Benjamin finished by describing the morning of the attack, how they had been awakened by smoke and gunfire, how they'd run through a hail of bullets while their home burned behind them. Marshal Crawford listened to it all in silence, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When they finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ruins of their house. "Judge Whitmore painted a very different picture," he said finally. "I'm sure he did," Samuel replied. "Question is, which story fits the evidence?" Crawford walked the property for the better part of an hour, examining the burn patterns, the bullet holes, the defensive positions the neighbors had taken during the fight. When he returned, his expression had hardened into something that looked like barely controlled anger. "Mr. Morrison, I need to ask you some direct questions, and I need honest answers." "You'll get them. Did you take those children from their legal guardian?" Samuel met his gaze steadily. "I took 5 starving children out of a barn where they'd been left to die. If that makes me a criminal, then I'll wear that badge with pride." "Did you refuse to surrender them to court authority?" "I refused to hand them over to men who wanted to sell them to work camps." "Yes." "Did you fire on peace officers?" Samuel's jaw tightened. "I fired on armed men who were shooting at children. If some of them carried badges, that's between them and their consciences." Crawford nodded slowly. "One more question. If I told you right now that you had to choose between facing federal charges and giving up those children, what would you choose?" Samuel looked at Elizabeth, at the 5 faces watching him with a trust he'd never expected to earn. "Marshal, there are some choices that aren't really choices at all. These children are my family now. You might as well ask me to choose between breathing and not breathing." The federal marshal studied them all for another long moment, then did something that surprised everyone. He smiled. "Judge Whitmore isn't going to like my report," he said, folding the warrant and tucking it back into his coat. "Your report?" Elizabeth asked. "Investigation shows no evidence of kidnapping, no evidence of unlawful detention. What I found was a family defending themselves against armed assailants who burned their home and endangered the lives of 5 children." Crawford's smile grew wider. "Seems to me like you folks have been the victims of a crime, not the perpetrators of one." The relief that washed over the group was almost palpable. Rose burst into tears, not of fear this time, but of joy. The twins grabbed each other's hands and jumped up and down. Mary ran to Samuel and wrapped her tiny arms around his legs. But Crawford wasn't finished. "There's more. Judge Whitmore's authority in this matter has been questioned by his superiors. Turns out using federal resources to pursue what amounts to a personal vendetta doesn't sit well with folks in Washington. He's been relieved of his position pending a full investigation." Samuel felt a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying lift from his shoulders. "And the children? Far as I'm concerned, they're exactly where they belong. Though if you want to make it official, I'd suggest you file adoption papers with the territorial court. Judge Whitmore's replacement is a fair man. He'll see that things are done right." That evening, as the marshal prepared to ride back to town, he pulled Samuel aside for a private conversation. "You know this won't be the end of it," Crawford said quietly. "Men like Whitmore have long memories and influential friends. You might find yourself facing other challenges down the road." Samuel looked toward the barn where his family was preparing for another night's sleep on borrowed blankets and makeshift beds. "Marshal, 3 weeks ago, those children had no one. Tonight they've got a community that's willing to fight for them, neighbors who'll stand guard, and 2 people who'd rather die than see them hurt again. If that's not worth a few challenges, I don't know what is." Crawford nodded with respect. "For what it's worth, I think you're doing something important here. Something that matters. We're just trying to give 5 kids a chance at the life they deserve." "Sometimes," the marshal said, mounting his horse, "that's the most important thing anyone can do." As Crawford rode away, Samuel stood in the gathering twilight, listening to the sounds of his family settling in for the night. Elizabeth's voice drifted from the barn as she told the children a story, her words weaving pictures of brave knights and rescued princesses and happy endings that seemed possible again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: rebuilding the house, filing the adoption papers, establishing the legal framework that would protect their family from future attacks. But tonight, for the first time since this all began, Samuel Morrison allowed himself to believe that they might actually win. Not just survive, not just endure, but truly win. The children were safe. The law was on their side, and a community had discovered that sometimes the most important battles were the ones fought not for territory or gold or power, but for the simple right of children to be children. In the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon, its voice carrying across the prairie like a song of wildness and freedom. Samuel smiled, thinking that it sounded remarkably like a lullaby. 1 year later, the Morrison Ranch looked nothing like the place where 5 frightened children had once huddled in a barn, forgotten by the world and left to die. The new house stood larger than the old one, with enough bedrooms for each child to have their own space, and a kitchen big enough to feed the neighbors who still stopped by regularly, drawn by Elizabeth's cooking and the sound of children's laughter. But the most significant change wasn't visible from the road. It lived in the confident way Benjamin walked the fence line each morning, checking for damage with the pride of someone who knew he belonged somewhere. It showed in Rose's bright chatter as she helped Elizabeth tend the vegetable garden, her voice no longer the frightened whisper of a child afraid to be heard. It echoed in the twins' constant plotting and planning, their minds finally free to dream beyond mere survival. And it sparkled in little Mary's eyes, which had learned to look forward instead of backward, to see possibility instead of only danger. Samuel stood on the porch of their new home, watching his children. And they were his children now, legally and officially, the adoption papers signed and sealed as they went about their morning chores. Elizabeth emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, and settled beside him on the swing he'd built from oak timber. "Thinking deep thoughts?" she asked, following his gaze to where Benjamin was teaching Mary how to properly milk their cow. "Thinking about how quiet this place used to be," Samuel replied. "How empty. Didn't realize it at the time, but we were just existing. Going through the motions of living without any real purpose." Elizabeth nodded, understanding completely. "Funny how sometimes the thing you need most is the thing you never thought to ask for." A rider appeared on the horizon, approaching at an easy pace. Samuel tensed automatically, old habits from the days when strangers meant trouble, but relaxed when he recognized the familiar figure of Marshal Crawford. The federal marshal had become something of a regular visitor over the past months, partly for official reasons, but mostly, Samuel suspected, because Crawford had developed a genuine fondness for the Morrison family. He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent more years in the saddle than on the ground. "Morning, folks," Crawford called out, tipping his hat to Elizabeth. "Mind if I water my horse?" "Help yourself," Samuel replied. "You're just in time for breakfast if you're interested." "Always interested in Mrs. Morrison's cooking," Crawford said with a grin. "But I'm also here on business." The children gathered around as they always did when the marshal visited, no longer afraid of his authority but fascinated by his stories of life on the frontier. Crawford had a gift for making even routine legal matters sound like grand adventures. "What kind of business?" Benjamin asked, ever direct. Crawford reached into his saddlebags and produced a thick bundle of papers. "Official business. Seems word of what you folks have accomplished here has reached some important ears back east." He handed the documents to Samuel, who read them with growing amazement. Elizabeth peered over his shoulder, her eyes widening as she took in the formal language and official seals. "What is it?" Rose asked impatiently. Samuel looked up from the papers, his voice thick with emotion. It's a charter from the territorial government. They want to establish this place as an official children's home." "What does that mean?" Mary asked in her tiny voice. Crawford knelt down to her level, his expression gentle. "It means that what your mama and Papa Samuel have built here is so special, so important, that the government wants to help them do it for other children too. Children who need homes and families just like you did." The implications began to sink in. More children meant more bedrooms, more mouths to feed, more hearts to protect. It meant transforming their private sanctuary into something public, official, scrutinized. "We'd need more space," Elizabeth said quietly. "More resources, more help." "All provided for," Crawford assured her. "The charter comes with funding for expansion, staff salaries, supplies. There's a condition, though." Samuel's eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of condition?" "You'd have to take children from wherever they're referred, not just the ones you choose to help. Some might come from situations worse than what these five experienced. Some might be difficult, angry, damaged in ways that won't be easy to heal." The family fell silent, contemplating the weight of such responsibility. They'd found their rhythm with these five children, had learned to balance individual needs with group dynamics. Taking on more, potentially many more, would change everything. "How many children are we talking about?" Elizabeth asked. Crawford consulted another document. "Initially, maybe 10 or 12 additional children. But if this works, if you can prove that this model of family-based care is effective, they want to expand it. Eventually, you could be caring for 30 or 40 children." The number hung in the air like a challenge. 40 children, 40 broken hearts to mend, 40 futures to secure, 40 chances to make a difference in the world. Benjamin spoke first, his voice clear and determined. "We should do it." Everyone turned to look at him, surprised by the certainty in his young voice. "Why?" Samuel asked gently. Benjamin's eyes swept over his siblings, then settled on Samuel and Elizabeth. "Because a year ago we were dying in a barn. If you hadn't found us, we'd be dead now, or worse. If there are other kids out there like we were, don't they deserve the same chance?" Rose nodded emphatically. "Benjamin's right. We know what it's like to have nowhere to go, nobody who cares. If we can keep that from happening to other children—" "It won't be easy," Elizabeth warned. "Some of these children might not trust us at first. They might fight against the help we're trying to give them." "Then we'll be patient," Mary said in her small but strong voice. "Like you were patient with us." Samuel looked at Elizabeth, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. They'd built something beautiful here, something precious and private and perfect for their needs. Opening it up to scrutiny, to regulation, to the needs of unknown children would fundamentally change the nature of what they had created, but it would also multiply its impact beyond anything they dared to imagine. "What do you think?" he asked his wife quietly. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving from child to child. These five miraculous young people who transformed their empty house into a home full of love and laughter. "I think," she said finally, "that love isn't something you hoard. It's something you share. And the more you share it, the more it grows." Samuel nodded slowly, then turned to Marshal Crawford. "What do we need to do to make this official?" The paperwork took the better part of the morning to complete. As they worked through the legal requirements and administrative details, the children peppered Crawford with questions about the other children who might come, about what their expanded home would look like, about when they might expect the first new arrivals. "Could be as soon as next month," Crawford admitted. "There's a group of children in Denver, orphans from a fire that took out most of a boarding house. 7 children, ages 4 to 14. They're in temporary care right now, but they need a real home," Rose finished. "Like we did," Crawford nodded. "Exactly like you did." That evening, after the marshal had ridden back to town, the Morrison family held a council meeting around their kitchen table. The children had questions, practical ones about sharing space and chores, worried ones about whether new children would change the family dynamics they'd grown to love. "Will they call you Mama and Papa too?" Mary asked, a note of possessiveness in her voice. Elizabeth reached over and stroked her hair. "Would that bother you?" Mary considered this seriously. "A little," she admitted. "But I guess if they need a mama and papa as much as we did, it would be selfish not to share." Samuel felt his throat tighten with pride. These children, who'd started with nothing, who'd been given every reason to become selfish and suspicious, had instead grown into young people with generous hearts and open minds. "There's something else we need to discuss," Elizabeth said gently. "If we do this, if we become an official children's home, there will be rules, inspections, people watching to make sure we're doing everything properly." Will they try to separate us? Joshua asked, speaking up for the first time in the conversation. Never, Samuel said firmly. You five are our children forever. Adoption papers, blood, bonds of choice. Nothing will ever change that. Any new children who come here will be joining our family, not replacing it. The conversation continued long into the evening, covering practical matters like sleeping arrangements and household chores, emotional concerns about loyalty and belonging, and excited speculation about the personalities and needs of the children who might soon join them. Finally, as the hour grew late and exhaustion began to overtake excitement, Samuel called for a final vote. All in favor of accepting the charter and opening our home to more children. 5 hands shot up immediately. Benjamin and Rose and the twins and little Mary, all voting with the confidence of children who'd learned that sometimes the scariest decisions were also the most important ones. Samuel and Elizabeth exchanged a look, then raised their own hands. Motion carried, Samuel said with a smile. I guess we're about to become the official Morrison Home for Children? That night, as the family settled into sleep, Samuel and Elizabeth lay awake talking about the changes that lay ahead. The challenges would be enormous. More children meant more complexity, more needs to meet, more hearts to heal. But they'd learned something important over the past year. Love wasn't diminished by being shared. It was multiplied. No regrets? Samuel asked softly. Elizabeth listened to the gentle breathing of their children in the rooms around them, to the night sounds of a ranch that had become a sanctuary. Only one, she said. What's that? That we waited so long to find them. Think of all the time we wasted being miserable when we could have been making a difference. Samuel pulled her closer, thinking about the 5 children who'd entered their lives as strangers and stayed as miracles. Tomorrow would bring new preparations, new challenges, new opportunities to prove that family wasn't about blood, but about choice, commitment, and love. Well, he said quietly, we're making up for lost time now. Outside their window, the prairie stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, vast and wild and full of possibility. Somewhere out there, other children waited in the darkness, children who didn't yet know that sanctuary existed, that love was real, that families could be found in the most unexpected places. But they would learn. Samuel and Elizabeth Morrison would make sure of that. The Morrison Home for Children would open its doors in just 3 weeks, ready to prove that sometimes the most important revolutions began not with grand gestures or famous speeches, but with the simple decision to see a child in need and say, you belong here, you're home. And so, friends, what began with 5 forgotten children huddled in a dusty barn became something magnificent, a beacon of hope that would guide countless other children to safety over the decades that followed. The Morrison Home for Children operated for over 30 years, providing sanctuary for more than 200 children who might otherwise have been lost to the harsh realities of frontier life. But the ripple effects of Samuel and Elizabeth Morrison's courage extended far beyond their ranch. Word of their success spread across the territory and beyond, inspiring other communities to establish similar homes. Their model of family-based care, treating children as beloved family members rather than institutional charges, became the foundation for what we now know as modern foster care and adoption services. Benjamin Morrison grew up to become a lawyer, dedicating his career to children's rights and legal reform. Rose founded the first teacher training college in Montana, believing that education was the key to breaking cycles of poverty and abuse. The twins, Joshua and Sarah, established a medical clinic that provided free care to orphaned and abandoned children across 3 states. And little Mary, she became a social worker, spending her life identifying children in need and connecting them with families who could provide the love and stability she'd found at the Morrison Ranch. But this story isn't just about the past. It's about the eternal truth that families aren't born. They're built by choice, by sacrifice, by the daily decision to love unconditionally and protect fiercely. Samuel and Elizabeth Morrison could have walked away from that barn. They could have convinced themselves that 5 orphan children weren't their responsibility. They could have taken the safe path, the easy path, the path that didn't risk everything they'd worked to build. Instead, they chose to see possibility where others saw only burden. They chose to fight when fighting seemed impossible. They chose love when love demanded everything they had to give. They chose to stand up to a corrupt system that treated children as commodities, even when that system had the full force of law behind it. In our modern world, there are still children waiting in metaphorical barns, in overwhelmed foster systems, in underfunded institutions, in circumstances that strip away hope and dignity faster than a prairie wildfire. There are still people like Judge Whitmore who see children as statistics rather than souls, who prioritize profit over protection, who use their authority to serve their own interests rather than justice. And there are still opportunities for ordinary people to become heroes simply by choosing compassion over convenience, by deciding that someone else's child matters as much as their own, by refusing to walk past suffering just because it's easier than getting involved. The Morrison family proved that sometimes the most powerful force in the world isn't violence or wealth or political authority. It's the unwavering determination of people who refuse to look away from suffering, who insist that every child deserves a chance at happiness, who believe that love is not a finite resource to be hoarded, but an infinite wellspring that grows stronger when it's shared. What about you? Have you ever encountered a moment where you could choose between walking away and stepping up? Have you seen injustice and wondered if one person could really make a difference? Have you ever looked at a situation and thought, someone should do something about this, only to realize that you might be that someone? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and your stories matter to this community. Tell us about the times you've chosen courage over comfort, the moments when you've stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves. The instances when you've discovered that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they're driven by love and determination. If this tale of courage and redemption moved you, if it reminded you that heroism isn't about perfection, but about persistence, show your support by hitting that like button. Your engagement tells us that these stories matter, that the lessons of the frontier still have relevance in our modern world, that the values of courage, compassion, and community are worth preserving and celebrating. Subscribe to Wild West Stories and become part of our growing family of frontier enthusiasts. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest adventures in the untamed American West, where ordinary people faced extraordinary choices and proved time and again that the human spirit is stronger than any force that tries to break it. And remember, you don't have to wait for the perfect moment to make a difference. You don't need special training or official authorization to show kindness to someone in need. Sometimes the most important revolutions begin not with grand gestures or famous speeches, but with the simple decision to see a person in trouble and say, "You matter. You're not alone. You belong here." Until next time, remember, the frontier may be gone, but the spirit that built it lives on in every person who chooses to fight for what's right, no matter the cost. Thank you for riding along on this journey through the wild heart of America, where legends were born not just from gunfights and gold strikes, but from the quiet heroism of people who believed that love could conquer any obstacle. We'll see you on the next trail, partner. Keep that pioneer spirit alive.